All right. This is Sirach, or how did you pronounce it, Jim?
Oh, I don't know. That's Glenda.
You said something, and then Glenda corrected you.
I actually thought it was from Star Trek myself. I thought it was Star Trek's Spock's father, but I made a mistake.
Sirach. I would have to guess Sirach or Sirach. All right. Well, let's dive into this. Like I said, this is a big book, 51 chapters. So it's no small book. But we aren't going to dig too deeply into it. I'll talk around the 50,000 foot and then around the 30,000 foot, and then we'll look at a couple passages. But in general, like we were commenting before we were getting started here, that it's a book that you kind of lose interest, but it has its place. And I think that that Glenda, you touched upon that when you mentioned the concept of wisdom and what is the need and the desire for wisdom. And I think that the reason for this book and the way it surfaced will become more clear as we talk about the context that it was in and what was happening at the time. As we noted, it is also called Ecclesiasticus. It is noted as Eccles, as in terms of a shorthand, and Ecclesiastes, very much similar to that. Ecclesiastes, I believe something relates to something of the assembly, the ecclesiological is the gathering of the people. I should have probably looked that up, but my Ecclesiastes, I believe it means like speaker or preacher to the assembly. And so Ecclesiastes, being the book of the Bible, would be something related to, the speaker speaking wisdom to the community. Unlike every other book in the entire Old Testament, including those are canonical and non-canonical books, this is the only one that actually has a claim of authorship that is direct, that is like signed, like this is me, and here it is. So it stands even in all of the canon and the Deuterocanonical books that this sort of stands out as unique in that regard. The author, as such, he was a Judahite scribe, meaning he originated from the tribe of Judah, and it is the Ben Sirach of Jerusalem. Now, if you remember, the Ben meaning from, or the son of Sirach of Jerusalem, and this is where the source of originally thought much of the wisdom came from, because the source of it would have been this was the grandson of the original sort of wise person who was the father, or the grandfather, who would have been Joshua, son of Sirach. And Sirach would have been what the book is obviously named after. So it goes grandfather named Sirach, son, middle son / father named Joshua, but also sometimes referred to as Jesus, the son of Sirach, and sometimes Yeshua ben Elisa ben Sirach. So what I think is interesting, going back to Shannon said to me on Sunday, why do you care so much that they changed the name of Jesus? Glendon, you were there on Sunday. I couldn't see who was there.
Yeah, I read that.
And I said, because names matter. So, if I start calling Jim, Bobo or something like that, and he's like, that's not my name. And I'm like, well, I don't really care. That's what I'm calling it. That's what I'm translating. Like that, so for me, I have this sort of internal, like, I don't know, like I said, it'd make a great nonfiction religious novel to write a book about a community who really started, praying and rebuking and doing things, not in the name of Jesus, but in the name of Yeshua. And then all sorts of stuff starts happening. I mean, I'm not going to make that movie, but that would be interesting. And it probably would be bad, because most Christian movies are, even the ones that Kirk Cameron made, although he did do a valiant effort to do that well. So good job, Kirk. But this is his grandson, and it's thought that he was writing it in Jerusalem in Hebrew, and there is some debate about that. most of the manuscripts we had until the 19th century from it were actually in Greek, and we'll talk about the transmission of that. But then in the 19th century, I don't even remember where I wrote that, somewhere if I did. In Cairo, it was found, and two-thirds of a, I can't read my own writing. 2/3 of a Hebrew manuscript were found in Cairo in the 19th century. So in the 1800s sometimes. So that gave them some indication that it was that it had an origin, or had some aspects of it that came, either that was an original documentation, or at least it existed in some Hebrew language. And then they also, in the last century, found it in the Dead Sea Scrolls and on the Masada Plateau in archival type stuff. But in the Cairo case, it was actually found not hidden or in some sort of weird area. It was found in a discovery of a room that they used to discard scrolls. So in other words, the 2/3 of it that were found in Hebrew it was a discarded scroll. So the presumption of that would be that that they discarded it because they copied it, and that was a bad version of it that they just didn't want to record, and they put it in there, or they discarded it because they didn't like it. I tend to think it probably was the former, but who knows? Could have been the latter. The dating of it is actually fairly close. They guess sometime between, the broadest dates that I saw were 200 to 175 BC. Several sources cited 180 as sort of being the primary target for that, although it wasn't translated until much later, until 132 by his grandson. And that's when we have the Greek version of it. And we don't know if it was translated in 132 from Greek to Greek, or whether perhaps he could have been using a Hebrew manuscript as well. We don't know, but probably not. It probably wasn't Greek. It was originally uncertain whether it was written in Egypt or whether it was written in Jerusalem in Hebrew. And again, it was probably thought to have originally, a lot of these sayings, a lot of the writings were probably written in Hebrew in Jerusalem, and later translated into Greek. In 132, when it was translated, we have a prologue. If you look at it, if you have a copy of it, there's this, before even chapter 1 starts, it's a definitively added prologue. It's not trying to pretend it, and we will actually read that when we look at it at the end. Actually, might as well read it now. What the heck, why not? I'll go ahead and read, since I have it in front of me. Many great teachings have been given to us through the law and the prophets and the others that followed them. And for these, we should praise Israel for instruction and wisdom. Now, those who read the scriptures must not only themselves understand them, but must also, as lovers of learning, be able, through the spoken and written word, to help the outsiders. So my grandfather, Jesus, or Jesus, or Yahshua, who had devoted themselves especially to the reading of the law and the prophets and the other books of our ancestors. So that, by the way, that I should say that, as we'll see in a little bit, that is a direct correlation. There's a lot of biblical references. So this is no doubt in the tradition of Judaism. The question just becomes, is it authoritative to the point where we would promote it to a level that we would use it to justify doctrine, or to use as some form of doctrinal statement. Where were they? So my grandfather and other books to our ancestors had acquired considerable proficiency in them, and was himself also led to write something pertaining to instruction and wisdom, so that by becoming familiar also with this book, those who loved learning might make even greater progress in living according to the law. So just a quick note, and we'll see this again. The living according to the law of Judaism was still an important thing. They were still under the law and the prophets, but you see this emphasis on learning. And I say that because that's important, because again, that whole region at the time was being Greek influenced, and the Hellenization was happening. And so Greek philosophy, and that's what, there's more Greek philosophy found in these books, or that were written around the last 400 years before Christ, than you would find typically in Jewish literature. You are invited, therefore, to read it with goodwill and attention. And this, as I'm reading this, I am making also a connection in my head. This is probably why it is sometimes called Ecclesiasticus, because it is almost put in that image of you gathering students around to teach. And the notion of the academy, where masters teach students, is straight out of Greek history and culture. And so you see the influence of that. He's saying this is important, we need to teach. So that's probably where you get some of that Ecclesiasticus connection. You're invited, therefore, to read it with goodwill and attention, and to be indulgent in cases where, despite our diligent labor in translating, acknowledging he translated it, we may seem to have rendered some phrases imperfectly. So this right there, because the manuscripts that we have in Greek later on, the early church fathers and all the way through up to the Reformation, although this is considered part of the Old Testament by the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, for the Protestant Church, that disqualifies it right there, because of the fact that it's kind of like, hey, there may be some errors, there may be some problems with this, and there's other reasons, but we'll look at those shortly. For what was, yeah.
In my book, it was called the Church Book, by for training the new catechums, or the
Yeah.
coming to the church. So because of all the teachings that it had in it. So.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, this is kind of a Hebrew. I was like, this is a little bit of like a Hebrew written in a little bit different type of literary form, but this is kind of like Benedict's rule.
Yeah.
But for the Christian community at large, or the Jewish community at large, in the sense, but it is fairly detailed about a lot of stuff, about how to handle a lot of stuff. It's very much so. It's like taking the wisdom of a scribe in the Hebrew tradition and adding your own commentary and examples to make it more colorful. But in that regard, it may make it more teachable. I mean, the presumption is that it was written, this was written and used. It wasn't like some guy wrote it and it was like that novel that no one ever saw. This was probably in wide circulation for some time, and for whatever reason it faded, it did, but there were still manuscripts of it. But in the tradition that they were in, the Greek influence on the focus on education would have been critical. And you see that actually, not only that, but even in some of the themes, the theological or the life themes that come out of it, they echo or reflect Greek ideology.
Was it meant to be used in sort of, what do they call schools where young boys are taught by the rabbis?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't exactly specify in the same way it would have been as rabbinic school, or whether it differentiates from a more Hellenized Greek, academy. But it does talk about, it does identify him as almost a teacher. He was a wide traveler teacher, and he led a house of instruction. So he was teaching someone, but this is the merging of cultures. So you have the Greek culture that comes over that would have this different tradition of education or pedagogy or teaching, and it merges or fuses with the Judaic understanding. And so this is one of the main, one of the main themes that you mentioned right at the beginning before we started was wisdom. Why is it so important? Well, wisdom is very important in Greek culture. The sapiential wisdom, like that's the goal of the philosopher. It's not to be knowledgeable, it's to be wise, it's to be the sage, the philosopher king. So when you combine that with a slightly different understanding of knowledge, in particular, as knowledge is far more abstract in Greek culture, culture than it is in Hebrew culture, where the wisdom would be the fear of God. So wisdom at its core is a right adjudication between you and the divine. In Greek culture, not necessarily. It is, it is, there it is it is the understanding and knowledge of the universe. And that's not denying some level of divine, but again, going back to Greek culture, you have a polytheism that exists in Greek mythology, and whether or not they actually claim some of those gods as gods, it still informed their understanding of some sense of, the divine. Man, I got an itch on my back. It's driving me crazy.
Dry skin.
I don't know. It's just one spot. It's just, I think it just, I'm going to take my pen back there. I was in a line at an Ace Hardware, and they had these back scratchers there once with these little metal fingers. And I was like, that look, the telescope sound. I was like, that looks like it might be useful. And I said, have you ever had someone just like try that out right here? And I said, like, not just on their like arm or something like that, but like shove it down the back of their shirt. And he's like, yeah. He said, more than you would expect. So, and I said, do they always buy them? He said, no, not at all.
No. Yuck.
Not that I would buy one of those. That's why we have sticks. Yeah. And children. Hey, scratch my back. And spouses.
And they never do.
What's that?
And they never do.
Yeah, I know. Okay, let's carrying on. Where was I? I'm going to look for my notes. Oh, let's go on to. I know the last thing I was going to say was that the original prologue was written in Hebrew as well. So that shows that he was written. That he was still fluent in Hebrew. So there was this is the whole point of, I think, is the fusion of culture and the fusion of wisdom. And if you look at it, as we think about the whole book as a whole, if you look at it as like, this is again about Jewish identity. It's about Jewish identity in the midst of a Hellenized culture, at the beginning of a Roman rule. All these cultures are converging, and the biggest concern is with the absence of a prophet. By this time, at the earliest, it would have been 200 years. 200 years. That's like 8 generational cycles, or more than that, 10 generational cycles ish. You have no prophet, no one speaking, no direction, no guiding. Like, it's just and this, and the vacuum is, you understand why you get the Pharisees and the Sadducees, because religious order and rule sort of begins to dominate those metropolitan areas and spreading out from there. But that notion of, well, if there is no voice from God, if there's no prophet, all you got left is the priests and the scribes. And so their importance is elevated, which makes, again, John the Baptist's arrival on the scene when he comes on so significant. Its canonical status is, it is considered canon by the Roman Catholic Church, by the Eastern Orthodox Church, by the Oriental Orthodox Church. Lutherans, Anglicans, Presbyterians, and other mainliners put it in the Apocrypha. And again, all of us in the category of, there's some things you could teach out of it. I mean, there's plenty. Like, as I was skimming through it, it looked like Proverbs. I was like, yeah, this is all good sense. This is good. This is good wisdom. So it's good, but not necessarily because of its source. We don't want to make it a source for doctrine, even though it may say some things that are congruent and true with other wisdom books that we do consider canonical, because the source itself is questionable. It's like, well, we don't want to say that, because then it makes everything worthy of constructing a doctrine around, if you would. It has, like many of the other books, it has a rich history of being sanctioned all the way from Hippo and the councils of Hippo and Carthage in the 4th century up to the 18th or 16th century, and Council of Trent. It is still not considered canon, though, in Jewish traditions, although it is considered again sort of more of an apocryphal, a reading or a writing. It is included in the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, and in the 2nd century, it was in the 2nd century. It was not included in the Greek canon after that, though. I think that no, I think it wasn't. I don't remember that. I'm not sure on that. I said that I said what I wrote, but I don't think I think I might have wrote it wrong. I don't know where it stood in the Greek canon after the 2nd century. Let's just go with that. Not that you really care what people thought of this book in the 2nd century, but it does. But one of these years I want to do church history with everyone. I think that'd be really fun, because when you start to look at the way these things are formed, it makes everything in the scriptures become alive so much more, because you understand how it's being used throughout the history of the church too. So we should do that, but we'll get there. The canonicity debate in terms of Protestantism, I would say there are probably 3 main reasons why. One, and also for the same reason in Judaism, its author was known. I mean, it's Ben of Sirach, and he wasn't a prophet for the Jews. He didn't stand out as being. He isn't. He may have some wise sayings, but he's not to elevate him as a wisdom book. And as a known figure, the only other known figure that is looked at as a wisdom figure would be Solomon, but did not have any sort of record beyond a really understanding of to lift her at that level would be problematic. For Luther and the rest, there was also the rabbinic rejection. And there is suspicion that the reason rabbis were rejecting it was around the 2nd century BC was because. Where the reason they were rejected, the rabbinic rejection came after. The reason they were rejecting is because this new Christian community was embracing it. So the very early first 200 years of the Christian community were looking at it as a possibility of being scripture. And because of that, and because of some of the things that connect to it, and we'll talk about that in the theological themes, that there were some rabbis who rejected it. The biggest thing, though, I think for Luther was just that it wasn't in the canon, and so it just wasn't part of the, that was a pretty simple line drawn in the sand. If it's in the Jewish canon, we'll include it. If it's not, we won't. So by virtue of that, some traditions completely reject it. Some of its features, it is considered, or not considered, it is the largest wisdom book of all of the, even those that are canonical and not canonical. It is the largest. Proverbs is 31 chapters. It's got 20 on it. What did I write there? Oh, it is also presented as coming from a single author. And even any of the other wisdom books, none of them are considered from a single source. So it's that's a unique thing. Both it has and it's been signed. It's been said this is who it is. It basically, in terms of its structure of its proverbs, it doesn't just offer sort of snippets or formulaic wisdom from the Hebrew tradition, which it does in the Hebrew tradition of doing so in the proverb sense, but it also offers these little bits of commentary or images that follow, which then lend itself to the idea of Greek pedagogy. It's like you're taking wisdom literature from the Hebrew side, and you're taking Greek pedagogy from the Hellenized side, and when you're combining them two, you're basically getting, hey, this is a good proverb, but it needs a little bit of fleshed out for the young folk learning, if you will. Also, one of the criticisms that it's received, and again, I didn't look too deeply into this. I just took it that I did find it in 2 sources that said this, that it lacks compassion for women and slaves, and for some have been loosely used to justify slavery and the not treating women as and it's problematic is for historians too, because of the way that it speaks in particular of women was not reflective of the Greek culture at the time and the Roman culture at the time, which had become probably made more interesting strides towards female power, if you will, or female empowerment. Not that was, that's not to suggest there was female empowerment at the time. I think it was still patriarchal, but you start to see some of those things break down. The content of it, if you want to sort of put it in, yeah.
You said that Sirach was only 20 verses, but I have one that goes up to 50.
No, 51.
51 chapters.
20 more than Proverbs.
Oh, 20 more. Okay. Well, and then I was just going through it. I never have time to really look, but it has a chapter 26 that talks about the joy of a good wife. It's not, so the women are placed, and then it contrasts a wicked life. So it says joy of a good wife, blessings of a good wife. That's 26. And so it's not like women are independent, but women are placed within the realm of marriage, I guess, a wife.
No, they would have been, that would have been typical for second and first century, for that region in that time as well. I mean, there's nothing, but I think that what the commentaries were saying is that, and again, I didn't look at all the passages, and I think you'd have to study it probably to see some, or read something that has studied it to see probably the nuance, because it's probably littered throughout. I kind of recall seeing a little, parenthetical thing with a bunch of references. It just wasn't something I was going to get too deeply into. But it makes sense if it's problematic because it doesn't reflect. I mean, people have challenges of, because it doesn't really reflect the changing of the time. So it might represent more Hebraic expressions of patriarchy than it does of Greek or Roman. It deals, but speaking of that, it deals with a lot of domestic relations, parents, children, husbands, wives, everyone spoke to, but so does the Proverbs for that matter. So let's, I don't want to make it unique in that regard. It deals with economic issues and crises, the challenges between the rich and the poor, and that's something we would saw in Proverbs as well. It deals with virtues, as it treats the virtues, even the use of virtues would have been a Greek influence in some regard. But the duties of a man to himself and to others and to God, and the sort of the responsibilities. And again, the focus would have been on the man, and it was on that there's duties to oneself, one's neighbor, and one's God. And that's, again, not uncommon in Hebrew literature as well, maybe not systematically organized in the way it is here, but it was still present nonetheless. It is influenced by Epicureanism, which was something, I think it was the 4th century, mid 4th century BC, that Epicureanism grew from a Greek philosopher who was a student of Plato. I think it was a student of Plato, and then, but it was a founder of the Stoics. If you think of Stoicism, sort of like the unaffected nature by the world, and the goal of Epicureanism is kind of, I wrote down hedonism light. That's how I remember Epicureanism. And it means that it's not necessarily, hedonism would say that you indulge yourself in everything life has to an abundance. Epicureanism would say that you indulge, you enjoy life's pleasures in moderation, to the point of happiness, not to the point of indulgence. But they both, whether it's Stoicism or Epicureanism, would say that you, in terms of pain of life, that the avoidance of pain is one of the aims of life. You try to, in every possible way, to avoid pain. And in doing so, you bring about deeper, lasting peace. Now, the Stoics would say that the pain is there. You just can, by rising above, can somewhat ignore it, not necessarily escape it. And I think Epicureanism, as a foundation of that, would say this similar, that you can escape pain not by ignoring it, but by changing one's disposition. So again, you have this strong. You have throughout this book, you have this sentiments that lend itself towards those ideas, and that would not have been a Hebraic idea that came from the Israelite wisdom books. Although this was a Jew, it was a Jew in the 2nd century before Christ. So it was a different type of Jew than you would have had in the 6th century or the 8th century. And noting the differences between those cultures is important to understanding the book as a whole as well. I think the last thing I would say just about the context or the content in it is this I did not dig in, so I really can't go beyond just what I wrote down. The book as a whole offers refutations of the idea that humans lack freedom, that God doesn't care about our actions, and that God doesn't reward virtue. And that would have been, could have been a combating ideas around Greek mythology at the time, that were sort of destined. Jews do not have the idea of a predestination to sort of framework for how the world works. They very much are understanding with full freedom. That's why they get their their punishment and reward system. That God doesn't care about our actions, that is not something that the Hebrews would have thought about. I mean, they would have accepted. God does care about our actions. Our actions have correlations to future events and, butterfly effect sort of thing. But that, not that God's punishing you in particular, but they wouldn't probably say to God that's not above God. And that God doesn't reward virtue. That's not true. God does reward virtue. Look at the virtue of Job. Look at the virtue, as naming one who was blameless. But, faithfulness leads to reward and blessing. Unfaithfulness, leads to punishment and curse. I mean, that's just at the core of Hebrew ideology and understanding of how God works in humanity with humanity. Time is it? I don't want to keep going. So let me point out a few things, and if we want to dig around in this, I have a few things that I think would be worth digging around in. They, just as a note for its connections to the scriptures, there are citations or thought to be citations of Sirach in several biblical books. I'll get to the major ones here in a second, but lightly in James, and we can come back to that in the Didache, which is the doctrinal teaching document for the church, which was not canonized. It was an acknowledgement that it was more like the Apostles' Creed, a summary, but it has references. And then other apocryphal books like the Epistle of Barnabas, and some of the early church fathers, Clement of Alexandria and Origen. So there were connections in these, and what that tells us is, one, if there isn't an actual connection to James and the Didache and the Epistle of Barnabas, which would have been written, some of them before, some of them after, around the time of Christ, but Clement and Alexander and Origen in the first few centuries of the church, that it was a document that was being used. That's kind of what it points to. Not that how they used it really matters as much, but the point that it was being referenced and used. Now, sometimes we can put too much emphasis on that. We're like, oh, it was being used, so it was important. Well, no, but it's not like their libraries were like 5 books. Not really, more than that. But I mean, it's not like, just because it was a source site, it might have been just limited sources, so it was used. Its connection to the Gospels is interesting, and if we were going to dig around and you wanted to look at something, we could do that for a few minutes. But Luke and Mark and Matthew and James all have passages that are very similar to passages in Sirach that are interesting. Even one quote that Jesus made in Matthew 11:29, and maybe we'll start with that one, look at that one. And then in Sirach, there's a quote of it that sort of matches in there. And so there are references that even they think that, that Jesus could have been familiar with Sirach. And if it was written 200 years before he was there, 180 years before he was there, then why not? If he was familiar with rabbinic literature, he would have been exposed to it. So it's kind of cool to think that it was a book that Jesus was familiar with and might have known. It has influenced Jewish culture. Although they don't consider it canonical, it is often quoted in rabbinic literature. It's used in a prayer book that they use for their highest holy days, the Mazor. It is also used has a framework that they offer for Jewish prayers. And although it's debated somewhat, it's the structure of the prayers that are found in Sirach are noted in other places in rabbinic Judaism. I would say last, before we look at those passages, just in general, the themes that are covered, it's a big book. And so these are wide sweeping: creation, death, money, sin. Sin is not a case for illness, actually, interestingly enough. Social justice, friendship, happiness, speech, honor and shame, the role of women, wisdom generally, and in particular Hebrew wisdom as being a reward for being faithful. That wisdom comes from that, and that's straight out of the tradition of Solomon seeking wisdom. Okay, so that's it in general. I have a few other things, but we don't need. Do you want to look at some of these passages?
The one I found, I sort of, I don't know, humorous was the very last verse of chapter 13.
Read it.
The heart changes the countenance either for good or for evil. The sign of a happy heart is a cheerful face, but to devise proverbs requires strenuous thinking. Like, oh, poor guy, he worked so hard at this. I just
Painful thinking.
kind of self, what, it kind of self-praise there or something.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, and again, this is one person writing. And honestly, as I read some of these, as I flip through, the thing I keep noting is the writing. I feel like the writing is pretty good. I'm like, this is actually more like not colorful writing, but it's more descriptive. It's more, sometimes I'm reading some of the prophets and I'm like, this doesn't make any sense to me, but this, it's readable. High readability. One of the passages I want to point out is Sirach 28:2, which says, forgive your neighbor the wrong he has done, and then your sins will be pardoned when you pray.
Yeah.
That sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? Does anyone harbor anger against another and expect healing from the Lord? And so if one has no mercy toward another like himself, he then can seek pardon for his own sin. So my point in saying and reading just that simple passage and is that, does that mean that someone in the Christ's time or Christ himself was quoting Sirach, or is this just a general proverb of general understanding, or is it just wisdom and they actually connect one another in concept, despite the fact that they don't connect in language? Luke, one of them, just since we're in the season of Advent, one of the references was the Magnificat that Mary, they said that Mary and Mary's prayer. And if you go to Sirach 10:14, Sirach 10:14, I got to find it myself. 10. The Lord overthrows the thrones of rulers and enthrones the lowly in their place, is compared to Luke 1:52. Matthew. Those little divots they used to have in Bible? I'd like some of those. You can go to the book real quick. Tabs. 1:52. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. Compared to, again, what did I say? 10:14. The Lord overthrows the thrones of rulers and enthrones the lowly in their place. So is that like, is Mary quoting that? Is she quoting that? I mean, like, yeah, it's referential, but like, honestly, I don't know if I would really. He brought down the powerful from the thrones and lifted up the lowly. Like, that's just general theme of much of prophecy. So this is the case where you start digging around like that. Those are there and it shows the connection of thought, but I don't necessarily always know if it shows the connection of quoting or of studying or of, passing down ideals perhaps. And again, if you sort of believe that Mary was given the Magnificat, the prayer from the Spirit, then the Spirit's leading in the prayer anyways. And if it was meant to be more of an exact representation of it, it would. But and these aren't the other connection points aren't there for the sake of trying to make an argument that it should be canonical, as much as it is that it is still a valid book for interpretation and for understanding of the time and the period. And I think it sheds more light on what they were going through around the 2nd century before Christ than it does, anything related to Hebrew scripture or so. But there's no major abuses other than it doesn't look at women and slaves very well. But I mean, you could make that argument about other books in the Bible as well to some extent, depending on how you conceptualize them. But every document is a representation or a reflection of the culture it's written in and the background of the person who is writing it. Which is why whenever I read a book, I always say, what is the hermeneutic of suspicion that the author is operating on? So often before I read a book, I'll Google an author and try to see what they're into. Because if you can construct that author's hermeneutic and how they're viewing the world, you can get an insight to as both what they're trying to argue and how they're arguing it, and from the perspective they're arguing it. So, and in this case, I would say he sounds like he's saving the wisdom of his father. He's concerned with teaching young Jews about who they are, appealing to a sense of Jewish wisdom over Greek wisdom in a time where these Jews in the 2nd century were losing their identity. So that's Sirach.
It
I
has
thought,
a negative tone because it's always do not, do not, do not, do not. You know, it's. I get that there are a lot of warnings in it, but there's not a lot of positive.
Well, and this is me just speculating and sort of making connections in my head, but I would have to compare that, or I didn't see anything that talked about. That's an interesting observation that could reflect not just the seriousness of wanting to form Jewish identity, and really those things would have been part of Jewish identity anyways. These are the do's and the don'ts, but there was a sense of Greek Gnosticism that still exists and is a precursor to Christ. That idea that the flesh is bad and you have to, and the Greeks were, as much as there's branches that were hedonists, there's also an extreme discipline there, and a rigor of discipline and character and building, the sort of building of virtues, and so that could have seeped in there. And so maybe the rhetoric is reflected of that. Again, without studying it up against Hebrew wisdom literature particularly, it'd be hard to really say for certain.
I thought I was just glancing through all the titles, and it seems to be kind of breaking it down to tangible things. The difference between things that happen, the deception of appearances, deliberation and caution, and a lot of everyday things that it's very clear. The worst of evil, the joy of a wife. And it's an interesting contrast. And I wish I had taken time to read it more, but foul language and concerning sexual sins. I mean, the preservation of friendship, it mentions a lot of friendship issues. And
also a Greek concept I will shout out. There's not the friendship literature in Hebrew on the Hebrew side is not strong, whereas the notion of friendship on the Greek side is deep. So I think that if you're seeing something like that, and it was really written very much so for you. And the way I picture it, just as I imagine it in my head, is I picture it like a classroom filled with 30 young men and a teacher up there telling them, this is how you live a virtuous life. This is how you live as a Jewish person in the 2nd century. This is how you integrate wisdom from your own tradition with the wisdom that you're being bombarded with every day in the society that you're a part of. So
would the students in his class be other Jews, or would it be some Greeks?
Yes, no, Jews. But Jews that, and that's the thing is, the fact that it was translated into Greek is not surprising, but the fact that it was written in Hebrew is an important concept, because that means that there was still Hebrew reading and writing at the same time. And it would have been for those amongst the learned. There's a major trend. As Greek culture swept into Hebrew culture, you had a higher literacy that grew. It wasn't just the scribes and the rabbis. There were others who were beginning to learn, because you had an entire culture of learning and an emphasis on learning within a culture that was being influenced. And just in general, it's just the development of human civilization. We eventually become smarter. Until now, this is the one of the few times in our culture where we're seeing a massive dip in literacy. But that's a whole nother subject.
Yeah.
And that's
the difference. Yeah.
Nora, you have, since we're not meeting the next 2 weeks, you have plenty of time to gain all the wisdom you need from this book. You could read a couple chapters a day and soak it up, and then report back to us when we meet. I think I wrote in the announcement for the bulletin. I was working on that today. I think we are returning January. I think we're returning at January 11th, but then we'll take the 18th off because I'll be in Chicago, and then I'll be back for the 25th, definitely. So I'll be back actually. We can decide we can decide. I don't really want to take the whole, that would be a long time to take off until if we took off to the 25th, it would be a whole month. But for some reason, if you don't want to meet on the 11th, then I guess we could take off to the 25th. But I probably would send an email and pool the whole crew. I should
Mhm.
stop recording.
Are you gonna